I am once again the luckiest man on the Upper West Side. I get to talk to Dan Morgenstern in his apartment, and there's a musician who's been very elusive, who's been running away from us session after session. It's the clarinetist and saxophonist Cecil Scott, and Dan promised me he has Cecil Scott stories.
Well, just let's talk a little bit about Cecil as a musician. You know, he had his own style on both those instruments. I always liked his tenor. Not that I didn't like his clarinet, but his tenor had that booting thing. And he's on Billie Holiday records, and he's with Teddy Hill, big band, and he is,
He's on
of course, Clarence, yeah, and Clarence Williams. Of course, that's the early stuff. And his clarinet is also very distinctive. It's sort of, you know, it has a kind of scratchy sound, but it's very appealing. And he was a really interesting player. And I got to know him when he was at Jimmy Ryan's, and I forget what band he was playing with. It may have been the first incarnation of Wilbur de Paris, or one of the things that before Wilbur started his, you know, whatever he called it, New Orleans, you know. And Bob Maltz, who ran the Stuyvesant Casino sessions, used Cecil quite a bit. And I remember Cecil at one of those sessions introducing a young student of his named Stephen Lackritz, and that eventually became Steve Lacy. And he was such a nice guy. He had a bum leg, as you know, and he told me once how that came about. And it's not funny because, you know, it gave him, but he told it as if it were funny. He told it on himself. He said it was I forget whether it was Mexico or New Mexico. It was on a gig, and he, you know, the day, whatever band he was with were there for, you know, some time, and he got involved with a woman, and it turned out that she was married, and that her husband was on the violent side. So he was in bed with her, and she said, "My God, my husband's coming." So he grabbed his clothing, and she was like, they were on the second floor, and he jumped out the window, but there was kind of a ditch, you know, like it wasn't, he fell into that and hurt his leg, broke it actually, but he couldn't get out of there because, you know, the husband was there. And so he laid there for several hours, long enough to cause permanent damage that, you know, wasn't fixable. He had, you know, this was a little diversion of his, but he had a huge number of children, as you probably know. It was either 12 or 13. And at one time I had a wonderful photo of him and his wife with all the kids who were, you know, of course, a variety of ages, but it got lost in an unfortunate incident where I lost quite a lot of stuff in a flooding of a basement. I wish somebody else must have that photo. So this was, you know, having to raise that many kids is what made him teach as well as play. And I think his wife had to work as well, you know, but I'm sure he was a wonderful father. He was a very warm guy. He had a great sense of humor. The way he told me that story about, you know, actually losing his leg, he had part of it was gone, you know. I had a prosthesis. He told it with a great deal of humor, and it told it on him. That's really having a sense of humor, to tell it on yourself, you know. I liked him very much, and I liked his playing a lot. And he was a good bandstand guy, you know. He seldom was the leader, but he was a good sideman. He was. And I like, you know, what I particularly, I mean, I like a lot of his stuff. I like his clarinet. There's a really nice Clarence Williams tune called Sweet Emmeline, of which there are a couple of versions. And then with the Teddy Hill band, there's a great China Boy, which has a terrific Dickie Wells solo, but it also has a very typical Cecil Scott kind of hiccupy tenor playing, and he had a big sound on tenor.
He reminds me in some way a lot of Pete Brown, that sort of bubbling energy. Any record that he's on is more exciting. Two things I think of. One of them is I read somewhere, you may have written it, I don't know, that he made money later in life by going to the public schools and showing the kids the artificial leg, how it came, how you put it on, how he took it off, and that he could really function with it. So that's sort of early disability studies.
I hadn't heard that, but it would be quite typical of him because it probably was his own idea to do that. And in part, of course, it's to make additional money to support his huge family, but it's also a do-good thing. So that's the way he was. He was a sweetheart.
Is that on some of the Dr. Jazz broadcasts, he's at the Stuyvesant Casino, I think, and he's in Lips Page's band. So maybe you cross paths with him there as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, he was often with Lips, you know, and Lips was the most agreeable leader, you know. But then, you know, Steve Lacy was that's another thing. He had students. He taught a lot. So he was a busy guy, you know. I mean, he was no kid anymore.
I forget how long he lived, but there's a recording he's on under Chris Barber's name, which I've never tracked down, but it's 1963.
Be my guest. I was at the session. I looked for that record for ages. I advertised in a British journal that I wanted to say, I'll pay anything for it. He does a thing on that called Prune Juice Blues. And the session was in the morning, and he's like, it was a great session, and you know, Chris Barber came and did all these things.
Wait, you were at the session?
Yeah. Okay. I wrote about it in Jazz Journal, but all of the sessions, everything came out, but this one, which is on British Columbia, I think, was very hard to get. It must have disappeared. I'm glad you mentioned. Let's try to find it. Let's go on the internet.
I have British collector friends. We'll make something happen.
Yeah, because I would love to hear it again. It was a real good session, and the Prune Juice Blues, of course, got a lot of laughs, and that was after it was finished, and Chris asked, you know, what do you call that? And he said, Prune Juice Blues.
Yeah, I think Ed Allen was on that session also.
Who?
Ed Allen, the trumpet player.
Yeah, because they had worked together with Clarence Williams, and then there were amazingly, I mean, that was really Cecil Steady. They worked in a taxi dance hall near Union Square for many years. I mean, even when he was at the Stuyvesant and stuff, they were still working there. Ed Allen was part of Bob Maltz's stable too, and Floyd Campbell and the washboard. Yeah. It was amazing when he put that together. That's one of the things that Bobby was good at. You know, he recreated bands that people only knew from records. Yeah, but Ed Allen, Cecil, yeah, they were together for a long time there. Okay. Yeah.
Well, now I'll track down the record. Okay, we'll be back.